Double Dragon returned after so many years. But did this return live up to the arcade legend? Double Dragon Revive arrived full of changes, and some of them are quite irritating older fans. From the revamped visuals to the pace of the fights, it seems like everything sacred has been messed with. So today, we're going to look together at the 7 most controversial changes that have left many people wondering, did they destroy the classic? When I look at Double Dragon Revive, the first thing that catches the eye is precisely this transition from pixelated 2D to detailed 3D. And, honestly, it's impossible not to feel a mixture of curiosity and distrust. The suit of the classics carried a very physical identity. Every punch felt heavy. Every movement had a dirty, almost imperfect, but absurdly lively cadence. In 3D, no matter how beautiful the visuals are, this feeling is somewhat diluted. The brawling seems to have lost that arcade weight. At the same time, I don't think 3D needs to be a villain here. In 2025, a lot can be done with it, especially in terms of dynamic camera work, lighting, and facial expression. Something the pixelated style, however nostalgic and striking, severely limits. The problem is when the 3D tries to imitate the energy of the 2D, but ends up falling into that limbo between realism and caricature. And unfortunately, that's precisely where Revive seems to stumble. The game is beautiful, but it doesn't always feel authentic. The anime-like style follows this same line of dilemma. It's visually appealing, full of vibrant colors and stylized characters, but it also completely changes the tone of the franchise. Double Dragon was always more dirty, more urban, that street-brawling atmosphere under neon light and the smell of gasoline. Now everything seems cleaner, more polished, almost too cute for a game born of brutality. It looks like the Lee brothers have gone from alley warriors to shonen protagonists. Many people, like Koji Ogata and other Japanese critics, are right to say this sounds cheap and modern. Not in the technical sense, but in the spiritual one. The anime style is everywhere today. Street Fighter 6, Grand Blue Fantasy vs. DNF Duel. So when Double Dragon Revive adopts this same mold, it loses a bit of what made it special. It was a series that had personality, and now it seems to be just trying to be like the others to fit the current standard. But there is a positive side I cannot deny. The game breathes new life into the younger audience. The anime visual attracts a generation that may have never touched an arcade machine. And if this reinterpretation is what keeps the Double Dragon name alive, there is merit in that. As long as the gameplay remains infused with the spirit of the series, that rhythm of impact, the frenetic co-op, and the intimidating bosses, perhaps this modernization doesn't have to be a betrayal, but just a new form of expression. Personally, I would still prefer to see a return to 2D with modern animation, in the style of Streets of Rage 4 or TMNT Shredder's Revenge. These games proved it's possible to update the retro aesthetic without losing the soul. Double Dragon Revive dares to follow another path, and as much as I respect that ambition, I miss the dirt, the pulse, and the visual violence that defined the series' original charm. It's beautiful, but perhaps too beautiful for the cruel world where the Lee brothers were born. This criticism of Double Dragon Revive touches upon an essential point: the lack of violence and Bruce-Lee-ness, that spirit of visceral and precise fighting that defined the original style. This change is something that messes with the soul of those who grew up with the franchise, because what made Double Dragon unique wasn't just punching enemies. It was the way each blow seemed charged with attitude, technique, and controlled anger. In Revive, according to Ebenuma and many nostalgic fans, this impact has been lost. The blows seem light, almost without consequence, and this dampens what was once raw and intense. The originals had a lot of Bruce Lee's philosophy ingrained in their structure, especially Jeet Kune Do, with its pursuit of efficiency and fluidity, something that perfectly matched the direct street fighting. Every punch and kick was more than an animation. It was an expression of strength and speed, inspired by the freedom and unpredictability of real martial arts. Double Dragon Revive, however, seems to have traded that for something more standardized, with overly choreographed moves, losing the improvisation and raw energy that were part of the series' identity. The problem is that when you remove this authentic martial vein, the game stops being Double Dragon and becomes just another beat-em-up. What always differentiated the Lee brothers was this aura of true warriors, not just stylized characters. Ebenuma even defines Revive as a poor job that shouldn't carry the series' name, a harsh phrase, but one that expresses the frustration of seeing the legacy he helped build transformed into something pasteurized. This also shows how the concept of violence in old games wasn't gratuitous. It was aesthetic. The dry brawling, the metallic sound of the blows, the pixelated blood, all of this was part of a visual and sound ritual that gave weight to the actions. Revive, by softening these elements to suit a more global and young audience, ended up diluting this characteristic. The combat has become technical and flashy, sure, but it has lost that dirt and that sense of danger that kept the player tense and excited at the same time. Still, it is important to recognize that the softening is accompanied by an intention to make the game more accessible. Arc System Works clearly wanted to balance nostalgia and modernity, and in doing so ended up sacrificing the franchise's rawer side. The combat remains responsive and precise, as noted in some recent reviews, but the absence of brutality removes some of the charm. It's the same dilemma as modern martial arts films, very well choreographed, but with little street soul. From a personal point of view, the Double Dragon that lives in memory is the one that made you feel the impact of the blow at your fingertips. It was a rude, almost primitive game, but with personality. Revive tries to bring this legacy to modern times, and although it fails to reproduce the flair and the heat of the old brawling, it still has potential to evolve. It just needs to understand one thing that Bruce Lee already said. It's not enough to imitate the movement. You have to understand the spirit behind it. One of the most controversial changes in Double Dragon Revive is precisely the choice to opt for darker scenarios, with filters and effects that, according to several former developers and fans, end up hindering the game's visibility and visual appeal. Unlike the classics with clean, colorful, and legible backgrounds, which perfectly highlighted the characters and the action, Revive bets on a darker and saturated aesthetic, seemingly wanting to convey a more cinematic atmosphere. The problem is that, for a beat-em-up, this can become an obstacle instead of a charm. When playing, it's noticeable that this visual direction tries to create depth and modernity. The dynamic lighting effects, such as shadows and reflections, are clearly designed to give a realistic feel to the streets and alleys, but the excess ends up making everything a little hazy. The reduced contrast between the background and the characters makes it difficult at times to understand what is happening on screen, something that never happened in the pixelated games of the 8 and 16-bit era, where every blow, character, and detail clearly stood out. This also changes the player's perception rhythm. In the past, Double Dragon was visually immediate. At a glance, you knew where you were, what you could break, and where the enemy was coming from. Revive, by darkening the scenario and adding visual layers of fog and particles, creates a sense of immersion, but at the expense of legibility. It's as if they were trying to transform a direct and colorful arcade design into something more sophisticated, but which, in the process, forgot the original purpose: to allow the action to be the absolute focus. Several critics and former developers including called this a technical error and misunderstanding of the visual language of the beat-em-up. And it makes sense. In a game where the experience depends on reflexes and the precise reading of animations, any interference with sharpness turns into a loss of rhythm. Revive looks beautiful in screenshots, but in the heat of the fight, this blurry style drains the impact. It's an irony. The game that tries to be modern ends up looking more visually tiring. On the other hand, it's important to recognize that Arc System Works' intention was to bring a more cinematic visual, reminiscent of the nocturnal and urban atmosphere of 80s action films, something like The Warriors or Streets of Fire. The idea was atmospheric, but the final result seems to lean more towards too dark. There are still moments where this choice works, especially in boss fights in areas illuminated by neon lights. But they are specific exceptions, not the rule. Speaking personally, I miss the exaggerated brightness, the almost saturated colors of the originals. Those orange skies and electric blue panels had personality. They called the player's eye and matched the exaggeration of the brawling. Double Dragon Revive sounds more serious, more contained, and in this process it loses that visual punch that was so striking. It's beautiful, but it's a type of beauty that doesn't vibrate with the player. It's a darkness that disguises power, when what the series always had best was precisely leaving everything on display. The chaos, the color, and the fighting wide open in the middle of the screen. Another change in Double Dragon Revive that divides opinions is, undoubtedly, the way its characters, especially Billy and Jimmy Lee, have been reinterpreted. In the classics, the two brothers were practically archetypes of the 80s action hero. Charismatic, determined, and with movements full of martial personality. Every spinning kick, every uppercut of theirs had an almost mythical aesthetic, something that mixed Bruce Lee with Hong Kong brawling cinema. In Revive, this charisma was replaced by a modern and anime-like design that many fans considered generic and full of unnecessary visual tricks. The new visuals of Billy and Jimmy are more stylized and even exaggerated. Jimmy, for example, now sports a cooler haircut, or dork, as some fans sarcastically nicknamed him, and a posture that distances him from that street-fighting icon he represented. Arc System Works' idea seems to have been to give the characters a more modern and marketable look, evoking a style close to Guilty Gear or Street Fighter VI. But the result, according to many analysts, is that the Lee brothers lost the raw magnetism they had. Now they sound too polished, with less weight in their presence and more focus on the pose. The abilities also suffered from this same excess of refinement. In the old games, the highlight was on moves that seemed natural, direct kicks, dry elbow strikes, that impact that resembled real fighting. In Revive, however, we see the addition of effects, stylized movements, and special attacks that, although visually striking, sound gimmicky, that is, more spectacle tricks than expressions of authentic power. This takes the game out of that dirty and street vibe and brings it closer to a theatrical fighting spectacle, which clashes with the aggressive and economical DNA of the franchise. This change divides even those who recognize the game's technical competence. On one hand, it is undeniable that Arc System Works brought visual dominance and fluidity. The animations are impeccable, and the combat sequences have a cinematic impact. But on the other hand, there is a lack of visual testosterone, that feeling that the Lee brothers are real fighters and not anime characters posing for the camera. It is the difference between the classic charm of the Street Fighter and the modern polish of the digital hero, and Double Dragon Revive chose the second path. This artistic decision also raises a question about identity. When you take away Double Dragon's dirty realism, the physical vigor, and the bodily charisma of Billy and Jimmy, what remains may be very beautiful, but also generic. And this is precisely what left former developers and veteran fans frustrated. Seeing characters that define the genre transform into safe versions, without that spark that showed why they were feared on the streets. It's not that it's poorly done, it's just soulless, visually loaded but spiritually empty. Personally, I think the biggest mistake is in the attempt to substitute physical charisma for visual style. The Lee brothers always spoke through their fists. They didn't need shiny effects to express intensity. Double Dragon Revive, in trying to modernize them too much, ended up exchanging contundency for aesthetics. And so, no matter how fluid and beautiful the game looks, what is seen on the screen is a domesticated representation of arcade legends. Characters who once carried the weight of the streets now look like anime stars. And let's face it, Double Dragon was never about shining, it was about fighting. Double Dragon Revive opted for simplification in controls and facilitated execution of special attacks. The classic games required a precise, sometimes even risky, combination of directions and buttons to unleash powerful moves like the Sosetsuken. This complexity was part of the series' pleasure. Mastering Billy and Jimmy was almost a learning ritual. In the new game, however, much of this technical layer was pruned in favor of a more fluid and accessible gameplay for all audiences, something the producers themselves describe as intuitive and modern. In practice, the inputs have become much simpler, unified commands for movements and specials that previously required a specific sequence. This makes the combat lighter and more agile, and facilitates the entry of new players, especially those who have never touched a classic beat-em-up. But for veterans, the feeling is one of loss. No matter how refined the system is, there is a feeling that the fight has lost a layer of depth, as if the easy commands made the mastery of the game less rewarding, and the brawling more predictable. Ebenuma, one of the saga's former collaborators, even called this change lukewarm, without impact. And this is exactly the problem. The combat may be smoother and more technical, but it lacks that tension of hitting the input at the right moment, which made every special move a mini triumph. This simplification removes part of the soul of the old Double Dragon games, where the player's skill was directly reflected on the screen and any mistake could be costly. It is also interesting to think about how this affects the sense of weight in the combats. In the past, executing the perfect move was a reflection of the player's mastery. The metallic sound, the enemy's pause before falling, the dry impact. Now the animations flow without interruptions, more elegant and accessible, but only beautiful, not intense. This visual and mechanical smoothness, although modern, dilutes what made classic brawling memorable. The risk and reward of having absolute control of the character. Of course, there is merit in the pursuit of accessibility. The idea of making Double Dragon more inviting is understandable, especially in a modern scenario where the audience doesn't want to memorize complex combos. Arc System Works clearly wanted to avoid the typical frustration of the 80s, making everything more responsive and natural. But in this process, it took away what made the franchise stand out from other beat-em-ups. The feeling that each character had a unique rhythm, requiring real mastery and practice, not just reflex. I believe that Double Dragon Revive suffers from the same dilemma as other modern recreations. It confuses simplification with refinement. The system is not bad, it is solid, functional, even fun, but it lacks personality. The old Double Dragon made you earn every move. Revive hands everything to you on a platter, and when the reward comes easy, the flavor is lost. The brawling still happens, but the sweat on the fingers that marked the arcade days, that yes, has disappeared. The issue of the renaming and alteration of the Sosetsuken martial style is perhaps the most symbolic and controversial change in Double Dragon Revive. The Ba, Sosetsuken, which literally means twin-cutting fist, has always been presented as a fictional Chinese martial art, directly inspired by Bruce Lee and the concept of pure martial efficiency. It was the heart of the Lee brothers' identity, something realistic, brutal, and functional, without magical tricks or fanciful special effects. In Revive, however, this style was reinterpreted and incorporated mystical and supernatural elements, such as the so-called Dragon Vein, which introduces almost magical powers into combat. This change is not just aesthetic, it alters the very philosophy of the franchise. The original Double Dragon was raw and grounded, two street fighters mastering an efficient martial technique. There were no fireballs, no cosmic energy, just fist, kick, and physical strategy. Now, by adding these supernatural elements, Revive brings the series closer to games like Street Fighter or Tekken, where mysticism and visual spectacle are central to the experience. It is visually impressive, but it completely dilutes the Bruce Lee roots tone that defined the Lee brothers. For the former developers, this is seen as a direct betrayal of the series' DNA. Ibanuma and other veterans harshly criticized this choice, claiming that Double Dragon was always about authentic martial arts applied in urban combat, something that connected the game with 70s and 80s kung fu cinema. Introducing magic and special powers removes this cultural connection and transforms the characters into generic superheroes, losing the charisma of being just extremely skilled martial masters. There is also the identity factor. The Sosetsuken was not just a name. It was a seal of authenticity within the Double Dragon universe. It brought narrative weight, a sense of legacy and tradition that the Lee brothers carried. By modifying this style or renaming it with new mystical concepts, Arc System Works ended up substituting this tradition for something that sounds more marketable and modern, but also generic. It's as if they traded the martial essence for the aesthetic of a shonen anime, where everyone has ancestral powers and inner energy. On the other hand, it is important to understand that this change comes from a legitimate attempt to expand the universe and give players something that sounds epic and cinematic. Arc System Works wanted to create a more robust narrative with fantasy elements that justified the hero's power and gave scale to the confrontations. The problem is that Double Dragon never needed this. The series' strength was always precisely in the simplicity and dirty realism of its fights. It was about surviving on the streets, not about saving the world with mystical powers. For me, this is the change that hurts the franchise's legacy the most. When you take away the Bruce-Lee-ness, what remains is just another beat-em-up with modern visuals. The Sosetsuken was the soul of the series, a promise that the Lee brothers were real masters, not science fiction heroes. Double Dragon Revive, by inserting mysticism and supernatural powers, transformed something that was unique into something common. And in this process, it loses what always made Billy and Jimmy special. They didn't need magic to be legends. They already were. This is perhaps the most controversial change that Double Dragon Revive faces, and perhaps the most painful for old-school fans. is precisely the fact that it was developed by an external team without any involvement from the original creators at Technos Japan. While the series' classic games carried the signature and vision of those who created Double Dragon in 1987, Revive was developed by Yuke's, a studio known primarily for wrestling games like the WWE series, and published by Arc System Works, which bought the franchise rights in 2015. This change of hands is seen by Ogata and Ebinuma as a loss of fundamental identity. The former Technos developers were direct in cutting in their criticism. None of them recognize Revive as a legitimate part of the franchise. According to Ogata, no person on the Technos team recognizes this as a Double Dragon game, while Ebinuma was even harsher, stating that the game was made by a current generation of game designers who have never played or completely played the arcade version of Double Dragon. This lack of direct connection with the original material results, according to them, in a product that does not understand the essence of what made the series special. The result is ordinary and modern, with no respect for the legacy. This criticism touches on something deep, the difference between inheriting a franchise and truly understanding it. Yuke's, despite being technically competent and experienced in action games, comes from a completely different context. Theatrical wrestling, choreographed spectacle, something distant from the urban brutality and martial philosophy of the Lee brothers. There is no visceral connection in the studio's history with arcade beat-em-ups, and this is reflected in the final product. Technically solid, but spiritually distant. It's like trying to recreate a 70s kung fu classic without having lived that culture. You can imitate the movements, but the spirit is not there. Arc System Works, in turn, entered the equation trying to bring its expertise in fighting games, which helped with the fluidity and responsiveness of the combat. However, the problem is that Double Dragon was never just about fighting technique. It was about atmosphere, attitude, and that feeling of survival on the streets that Technos Japan knew how to capture perfectly. Arc may be excellent at what it does, but its visual and mechanical language comes from another school, one that prioritizes competitive spectacle over raw urban narrative. And in this, Revive ends up sounding more like a game inspired by Double Dragon than a true successor. Ebinuma even compared the game to a test project for vocational school students, a devastating criticism that suggests amateurism and lack of care. He also said that Double Dragon always had a strong momentum and a unique and distinct feeling, but that Revive has none of that, to the point of wishing the game didn't carry the franchise's name. This demonstrates how much the original creators feel. The legacy has been disrespected, transformed into something generic and commercially palatable, but empty of soul. In my opinion, it is impossible not to feel the pain of this transition. Double Dragon was not just a game. It was a declaration of cultural identity of 80s Japanese arcades. When you pass the rights to studios that didn't live through that era, that didn't smell the arcade machines or the tension of putting in the last coin, something is inevitably lost. Revive may be a good modern action game, but it is not Double Dragon in the spiritual sense. It is a commercial tribute made by those who admire from afar, but not by those who helped build the legend. And in this, the Technos veterans are completely right to feel betrayed.
足りねえ。もっと強敵を俺に食わせろ。創設権とかいうやつを俺に見せてみろ。無敵だぜ。生きのいいやつらだ。実験体に最適だな。お前たちに恨みはないが、ここを守るのが俺の仕事なんだ
な。どうされると痛いかな。私が排除します。